The fire came first. Then the screaming. A woman on her knees in the sand, hands buried in something warm and wet she will not let herself look at. Above her, the wagon canvas has already burned to black lace. Sparks climb into a sky, so full of stars it looks indifferent. A child's shoe lies alone in the sand. No one will ever explain why. She holds a leather journal against her chest. Her knuckles have gone white around the spine, and stayed that way. A horse tears through the smoke. The rider's face is streaked white, not the wild paint of dime novels. Lines. Precise. Deliberate. Like a signature a man leaves on his own work. His eyes find her. She braces for hatred. She almost wants hatred. What she gets is purpose. Cold. Total. He dismounts slowly. Like a man, with nowhere else he needs to be. And in the ash beneath her, a half-burned scrap of paper turns over, pressed with a wax seal bearing a name she once heard spoken at a Boston dinner table. He crosses the sand toward her. The fire came first. Then the screaming. Cordelia Winslow would remember it in that order for the rest of her life. Not screaming, then fire. Fire, then screaming. Because that was the order the world broke in, and a person doesn't get to choose the order these things arrive. She was on her knees in the sand. Hands buried in something warm and wet that she did not let herself look at. Above her the wagon canvas was already gone, eaten to black lace by the flames, and sparks rose off it, into a sky, so full of stars it looked indifferent. Which it was. Stars don't care. She would write that down later, if there was a later. Stars don't care who burns beneath them. Run, Cordelia. Silas, no. Not Silas. Silas was 6 months dead in Boston clay. This was Amos Whitfield, the wagon master, and he was saying her name, with an arrow already buried to the fletching in his throat, and he said it anyway. He said it around the blood. Because that was the kind of man he was. The kind who spends his last breath on someone else's name instead of his own pain. She did not run. She tried. Her legs simply would not agree to it. Because her journal was still in her arms, she'd grabbed it, without thinking, the leather warm, from being pressed against her chest, through 3 months of road dust and river crossings, and some idiot animal part of her brain had decided that if she held onto this one thing, this one small rectangle of her husband's handwriting pressed between the pages, then the rest of the night might not be real. It was real. A horse broke through the smoke 10 feet from her. Paint markings across its flank. A rider low over its neck. Behind him the whole camp unraveling into chaos, canvas burning, oxen screaming, a child's shoe lying alone in the sand for no reason anyone would ever explain. The rider's face was streaked white. Not war paint the way the dime novels drew it. Not some cartoon of savagery. Lines. Precise. Deliberate. Like a signature a man leaves on his own work. His eyes found her. And that was the part she couldn't explain to anyone afterward. Not to her brother. Not to the officers, who debriefed her weeks later. Not even to herself at 3 a.m, with the journal open on her knees. Because in his eyes there was no hatred. She braced for hatred. She wanted hatred, almost, because hatred she understood, hatred was a language the whole burning world seemed to be speaking that night. What she got instead was purpose. Cold. Total. A man doing a job he had decided, long before this fire, needed doing. Please. The word came out of her, before she'd chosen it. Please, my brother, he has money, in San Francisco, whatever you. Silence. He dismounted. Not fast. That was the thing that undid her more than speed would have. He came down off that horse like a man, with nowhere else he needed to be, and crossed the sand toward her, and Cordelia found herself doing the arithmetic of survival, with no time at all to solve it. Fight. Fight and die in the next 10 seconds. Or don't. She didn't. He bound her wrists. Efficient. Not cruel exactly. Cruelty would have required him to feel something about her, and he felt nothing she could read, and somehow that absence was worse than a blow would have been. He lifted her onto the horse the way a man lifts a sack of grain he intends to make use of later. Her journal was still in her hands. She would not remember, afterward, deciding to keep holding it. Her knuckles had simply gone white around the spine, and stayed that way for the next 6 hours. He swung up behind her. His arm came across her waist. Not gentle. Not brutal either. Just final. Like a door closing on a house she would never see the inside of again. A voice called out, through the smoke, words in a language like water moving over stone, and the rider answered, with one short syllable, before driving his heels into the horse. They went. Boston. Rain on a headstone. That's where this really starts, if a story like this can be said to start anywhere, which it can't, not truly. Because grief doesn't start. It just arrives, and then it stays, and rearranges the furniture of a whole life, until nothing is, where it used to be. Silas Winslow had been dead 11 days. Cordelia stood at Mount Auburn Cemetery in a black dress, that had cost more than most families spent in a month, and she listened to a pastor say the Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away, and she actually thought, standing there, 29 years old, and already a widow, that the Lord could keep whatever he liked. She would have traded every hymn in the book for one more morning of Silas reading Marcus Aurelius aloud to her, over cold coffee, correcting her Latin, without even looking up from the page. Fever took him. 6 weeks of it. Long enough to hope. Not long enough to prepare. She had sat up with him 14 of those nights, cooling his forehead with a cloth that never stayed cool for long, and she had believed, because believing was easier than the alternative, that a man, that strong, that clever, that impossibly alive, simply could not be finished off by something as ordinary as fever. He was. And still young enough to remarry, someone whispered at the reception afterward. Some cousin of a cousin. Meaning it kindly, probably, meaning it the way Boston meant most things kindly, with a small blade folded inside the kindness, where you wouldn't notice it, until it was already in. She went home to a house full of his books, and none of his voice. For weeks she did nothing, but rearrange his shelves. Because that was a task with edges. A task she could finish, unlike grief, which had no edges at all, which simply spread. Her brother Edmund's letter arrived in March. Arizona Territory, he wrote, in the cramped, hurried hand he'd had since boyhood. Land for the taking, Cordy. Communities out here are starving for teachers, real teachers, not finishing school chaperones. There's freedom in this country. Not the parlor kind. Space to breathe. Come west. Build something new, from the ashes of what happened. I'll meet you in San Francisco myself. Freedom. She turned the word over so many times it stopped meaning anything, the way any word will, if you repeat it enough. She sat with the letter in her lap for 3 days, before she answered it. The journey will be dangerous, Edmund had warned, further down the page, almost as an afterthought, the way men warn women of danger, when they've already decided the woman will go regardless. The territories remain wild in places. Lawless, some of them. But you were never suited to a small life, Cordy. Neither was Silas. He'd tell you to go. That last line was the one that decided it. Because he was right. Silas would have told her to go. Silas had spent a decade telling her that the whole point of a mind like hers was that it refused to stay small. She sold the townhouse within the month. Kept his books, all of them, every volume, packed with more care than she packed her own dresses, her writing case, and precious little else. A woman traveling alone into wild country does not travel with China. She learned that lesson before she'd even left Massachusetts. The wagon train assembled in St. Louis in early spring. 14 families, a scattering of single men chasing gold, or land or simply distance, from whatever they were running from, and Amos Whitfield at the head of it, a wagon master, with 20 years on the trail, and a laugh that made the whole camp feel, for an hour or two each evening, like nothing terrible could possibly happen to people who laughed that easily. She should have known better. Everyone should have known better. But hindsight is a luxury the living get, and the dead don't, and Cordelia had not yet learned to distrust a man simply because his laugh was good. She understood danger differently now. 6 months later. Bound at the wrists. Riding into mountains she'd never see on any map her brother owned. Dawn came the way dawn does, when it doesn't care what happened the night before. Rose and gold over unfamiliar peaks. Pines instead of the scrub they'd left behind. Thinner air, sharper, each breath costing something it hadn't cost the day before. Cordelia's whole body had gone past aching, into a kind of numb static. Her wrists were raw, where the leather had rubbed through skin. When they finally rode down, into a hidden valley, a stream running clear, through the middle of it, dwellings of bent brush and hide clustered along the bank, smoke rising thin and domestic from cook fires, as if nothing in the world had gone wrong anywhere, ever, she was pulled off the horse, with no more ceremony than luggage. Her legs buckled. A hand caught her elbow. His hand. Steadying, not tender. The grip of a man preventing damage to something he intended to make use of. Women came out from the dwellings. Faces doing 3 things at once, relief for the returning riders, curiosity at the stranger, and under both of those, something colder. Suspicion. Children peered out, from behind skirts, pointing at hair the color of dead grass in a country that had never seen hair like that. An older woman approached. Face like a map of every hard winter she'd survived. She looked Cordelia, over the way you'd look, over a horse you weren't sure you wanted to buy, said something sharp to the rider, Natoni. Cordelia would learn his name was Natoni. Though not yet. Not in this chapter of the story, and he answered, with a gesture, and walked away. Which left Cordelia alone, with the old woman, who seized her arm, and hauled her toward a smaller shelter. English? Cordelia tried. Her voice cracked on it. Do you speak English? Nothing. A shove toward the entrance instead. Inside, dim light, the smell of smoke, and tanned hide, a floor of packed earth under woven mats. The old woman pointed to a pile of hides in the corner. Then to a stone grinding tool beside a basket of corn. Work. First English word Cordelia had heard, since the fire. Then the woman's eyes went to her hair. Reached toward it. Drew back like she'd touched something that might bite. Too bright, she said. Bad luck. She spat on the ground and left. That first day, Cordelia ground corn, until her hands split open, and bled into the meal. Every circular motion of stone on stone became something between a prayer, and a scream she wasn't allowed to let out loud. Silas's face kept surfacing behind her closed eyes, not the fever-yellow face, from the end, thank God, but the good one, the one that used to light up mid-argument about Seneca like he'd just discovered fire, that morning, and wanted her to see it burn too. I will survive this, she told him, silently, because he was the only audience left, who might understand why that mattered so much. At dusk, Natoni came back. He found her standing in the center of the shelter. Chin up. Blood-crusted hands clenched at her sides, because pride, apparently, was the last possession they hadn't managed to take from her. Why am I here? Not a question. A demand dressed as one. What do you want? He set a wooden bowl on the ground. Rabbit stew, wild greens. Pointed at it. Then at her. Turned to leave. Wait. The word came out sharper than she meant it to, desperation cutting through whatever dignity she had left. Are you going to kill me? Ransom me. I need to know something. He paused in the doorway. Looked back. There was a hesitation in him she hadn't expected. As if she'd become, in that half-second, something other than plunder. Eat. His voice was low. Rough at the edges, like a road that hadn't been traveled in a while. Tomorrow, work. You, because I choose it. Others wanted your scalp with the rest. Brutal honesty. It landed like a blow, and she took it standing. Why, she whispered. Why spare me when you killed everyone else? His jaw set. Moonlight through the smoke hole cut his face half silver, half shadow. Your people push us, from our hunting grounds, he said. Your soldiers kill our children. Your sickness takes our old ones. A beat. We take what payment we can. I'm not responsible for that. Anger, finally, cutting through fear. I'm a widow. A teacher. And I was a boy, he said, when soldiers burned my mother's village. That stopped her cold. A girl, he went on, quieter now, and this was the part, where his voice actually shook, just once, just barely. Hair like yours. Hid with me behind rocks. Soldiers found her. Cut her throat, while she begged them, in English. They didn't care she spoke their tongue. Silence, after that. A real one. The kind that has weight, the kind you could set something down on. I'm sorry, Cordelia said. And meant it. For that girl. For what was done to your people. He blinked, once, slowly, the way a man does, when a stone he's carried a long time gets set down for him by someone he never expected. Words mean nothing, he said. Actions tell truth. He nodded at the bowl. Eat. Build strength. A starving captive is a useless captive. Gone, then. Out through the low doorway, before she could answer. She ate. Fingers still crusted, with corn dust, and her own blood. And somewhere in that meal she made a promise to herself, that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with who she intended to still be, when this was over. Survival would only be the beginning. Days folded into each other. Grinding corn. Scraping hides until her fingers stopped feeling anything at all. Hauling water from the stream, while her skin went, from Boston pale to something burned, and then bronzed by a sun that did not negotiate with anyone, least of all with her. The women watched her. Some with curiosity. More with contempt. White Witch, one hissed at the stream one morning, deliberately shouldering her, so the water sloshed, from the jar, and soaked through the front of her dress. Your kind killed my sister at Sweetwater Creek. I've killed no one, Cordelia said. Even. Steady. Because showing weakness here would be its own kind of death, slower than an arrow, but just as final. The woman's face went hard as flint. All white eyes the same. She spat. Snakes. All have poison. Cordelia said nothing back. There was nothing to say back, that wouldn't make it worse, and she was learning, slowly, painfully, the specific arithmetic of a place, where every word cost something. Nights, she talked to Silas in the privacy of her own head, because the alternative was a silence, so total it might have swallowed her whole. She kept the journal hidden in a crack between the support poles, wrapped in a scrap of hide, and each night, by the failing light, through the smoke hole, she wrote. Observations. Plans. Anything that kept the thread between this Cordelia, and the one, who used to exist connected, unbroken, still hers. One woman was different. Young. Barely past girlhood herself. My name Kimamila, she said one afternoon, showing Cordelia how to work a rabbit skin, without ruining it. Means butterfly. Cordelia. Kimamila tried the syllables carefully. Got most of them. Hard name. Many sounds. Tilted her head, studying her the way children study something they haven't decided, yet whether to trust. You have husband? He died. Fever. Before I came west. Kimamila's whole posture eased, just slightly. Sickness take my mother too. A pause. Make heart hurt same. For all people. It was such a small thing, one sentence of shared grief, and it did more to bridge the distance between them than a week of forced labor ever could. You're a teacher, Kimamila said, once Cordelia had explained it, piece by piece, in the halting mix of English and gesture that had become their only shared language. You know things from books. Stories, Cordelia offered, simplifying. Numbers. How the world works. Kimamila's eyes brightened. Tell me sometime. I know some English. Want more? Why more? Cordelia asked, curious despite herself. Because world getting bigger, Kimamila said, with a shrug that seemed older than her years. Soldiers not going away. Better to understand than not. It was the first invitation Cordelia had received to be anything other than a captive. She took it like a drowning woman takes a rope. Their lessons became a ritual. Each evening, while the light held, they sat by the stream, and traded words like small, careful gifts. Kimamila wanted English. Cordelia, hungry for anything that felt like purpose, gave it freely, and found herself receiving the stone-wind tongue in return, whether she'd asked for it or not. In English, Cordelia explained one evening, we say I am sad. As if sadness is something I possess. Something I become. We say different, Kimamila offered. Closer to, sadness visits me. She frowned, hunting for the shape of the thought in a language not her own. It passes through. Not stay forever. That's rather wise, Cordelia said. Not wise. True. Kimamila smiled, a rare, unguarded thing that changed her whole face. Bad feelings visit. Good feelings visit too. Must notice while they hear. Such exchanges pierced the barrier between them in small, unexpected places, and Cordelia began recording them in her journal at night, alongside the more practical notes. The path east. The guard rotations. The dates the men rode out to hunt. Because she had not stopped planning. Whatever softness was growing in her toward Kimamila, toward the strange rhythm of this place, she had not for one single hour stopped planning her way out of it. Not everyone extended even the smallest kindness, though. There was a warrior. Young. Cordelia did not, yet know his name, that would come later, and when it came it would come, with consequences, but she knew his eyes, because they found her constantly, and there was nothing soft in them at all. Only a kind of banked, waiting anger, like a fire someone had smothered, but not put out. He never spoke to her. Not in that first stretch of weeks. But she felt him watching, and some animal instinct at the base of her skull kept a running account of it, filed it away, understood without being told, that whatever patience Natoni was extending to her, this man had none of it, and never would. The woman who had first claimed her, Winona, Cordelia learned her name eventually, and learned to fear, and respect it in roughly equal measure, began appearing more often. Treating the split skin on Cordelia's hands, with something bitter-smelling, that stung first, and healed after. Foolish girl works too hard, too fast, Winona muttered, in English far better than Cordelia had expected. Desert not kind to soft skin. Why do you help me? Cordelia asked one evening, unable to keep the question in any longer. The others want me dead. Winona's ancient eyes assessed her, unhurried, the way a woman assesses something she has already decided about, but wants to confirm one more time, before she says it out loud. Natoni say you have strong spirit. A pause, weighing something further. There is old story. White woman taken long ago. She learn our ways. Become one of the people. Teach much wisdom. Cordelia went very still. That woman, Winona said, watching her face carefully, as she said it, was Natoni's mother. The floor of the world tilted slightly. Cordelia's voice failed her halfway, through the word. His mother was white? Pennsylvania woman, Winona said. Taken in raid, many years past. She choose to stay. Choose this life. Taught him to see with two eyes. She tilted her head. Perhaps this is why he spare you. Perhaps not. Natoni does not explain himself to old women, even ones who fed him, as a baby. That explained the English. That explained the eyes, that held purpose instead of hate the night of the fire. That explained everything, and nothing, all at once, and Cordelia found she had no ready response to any of it, only a growing, uneasy sense that this camp, this man, this whole impossible situation, was built on a foundation far stranger, and older than she'd first understood. Does he know, Cordelia asked slowly, what it is to be neither one thing, nor the other? Fully. Winona's mouth pressed into a thin, complicated line. Ask him yourself, she said. If you dare. He does not like the question. But he knows the answer better than any man alive. 2 weeks became her rhythm. She learned the camp's shape, where the guards walked, when the hunting parties left, which paths saw the least traffic. She learned, without letting herself examine too closely why she was learning it, so carefully, exactly where the eastern tree line thinned, into something that might, possibly, lead toward a settlement. And she overheard, one evening, mention of a ceremony. 3 days out. One that would draw the whole camp inward, toward the central fire, at dawn. Which meant 3 days, until the least watched morning she was likely to get. She spent those 3 days behaving, as though nothing had changed. Ground corn at the usual hour. Fetched water at the usual hour. Let Kimamila teach her 3 new words she did not truly need, because a woman about to run does not act like a woman about to run, and she had learned, that much, at least, from every hour spent watching this camp watch her. She told no one. Not even Kimamila, whose friendship she had come, cautiously, to trust, because trust, she was learning, was a currency you spent carefully out here, and this particular coin she needed to keep for herself. Dawn came with drums, and chanting, and the whole camp turned inward toward the fire, and Cordelia went the other way. Her heart was doing something violent in her chest. She slipped between shelters. Reached the tree line. Nobody called out. Nobody came. And for one long, impossible moment, freedom tasted like pine, and cold morning air, and she thought, she actually let herself think, that this might work. She did not take the obvious trail. That would be the first place they'd look. Instead she cut her own path, using the sun, climbing, always climbing, legs burning with the effort of it, lungs burning too, in air that seemed determined to give her less of itself the higher she went. By midday the sky had gone the color of a bruise. She saw it coming, from a ridge, a wall of wind, and sand rolling toward her across the valley like something alive, something with intention, and she had perhaps 90 seconds to find shelter, before it swallowed the whole world. She found a crevice. Barely wide enough for her shoulders. Pressed into it, as the storm hit, and the world dissolved, into howling and grit, and a darkness, that had texture, that scraped, that got into her mouth, and eyes no matter how she covered them, with the torn hem of her dress. Silas. His name arrived in her head clear this time, no confusion in it at all, just the plain fact of him. I'm trying, she told him. God knows I'm trying. Hours. Her lips cracked from thirst. And the sand was filling the crevice, from below, slowly, patiently, the way a grave fills, and she understood, with sudden clarity, that staying meant being buried standing up, in a country that didn't even know her name. She climbed, shoulders scraping raw against stone. Found, at the very edge of what her body could still do, a gap, a horizontal passage, barely wide enough to crawl. She went into it on elbows and knees because there was no other direction left to try. Darkness. Absolute. The storm's voice fading to something distant, almost gentle by comparison. Then light. A gray softening ahead. She nearly wept at it. She emerged onto a ledge cut into a cliff face, sheltered from the worst of the wind. And below her, a drop of several hundred feet to a canyon floor she could not see the bottom of. Trapped. That was the word for it. No way down. No way. She was crawling back, through that tunnel, into a crevice now filled with sand. Her throat burned. Her stomach cramped. 2 days, she thought. Maybe 3, before the arithmetic of dehydration finished what the storm had started. A sound above her. Boot on stone. Distinct from the wind, deliberate in a way the wind never was. She pressed herself flat against the rock. A shadow came down the cliff face, with a confidence that should not have been possible in these conditions. Landed on the ledge in a controlled crouch. Straightened. Natoni. Sand crusted his hair. His clothes. But there was no fatigue in him at all, and his eyes found hers immediately, and in them she read something complicated, anger, yes, but tangled up, with a reluctant thread of respect he clearly hadn't expected to feel, and hadn't wanted to. You choose death, he said. Not a question. A gesture at the storm, the drop, all of it. I choose freedom. Her voice came out raw. Even the freedom to die on my own terms. Freedom. He said the word like he was tasting something foreign, testing whether it was safe to swallow. What is freedom worth, paid with a life? Everything. She met his eyes, and did not look away. What is life worth, without choice? He went quiet a long moment, studying her the way a man studies ground he's about to have to cross whether he trusts it or not. The woman who prefers death to captivity is rare, he said finally. He extended his hand. Not seizing hers. Offering. Come back. Prove your spirit in living. Not dying. She stared at the hand. Weighed it against the drop, against the sand-filled crevice, against every version of the rest of her life, that either choice implied. And what would that mean, she asked. Grinding corn until you tire of me? To learn our ways, he said. 3 moons. You learn our ways for 3 moons. If you still wish to leave after, I take you to the trading post myself. She searched his face for the lie in it. Found only certainty, flat and total, the same certainty she'd seen the night the fire took the wagon train. And if I refuse this bargain, she said. Right now. On this ledge. Then you refuse it, he said simply. And I climb down without you. And the desert decides instead of either of us. Part of the ledge crumbled beneath her boot. Stones fell into nothing. His hand shot out, closed around her arm, pulled her back, before she'd even registered the danger. Choose, he said. Death comes quickly here. 3 moons. Her voice steadier than she had any right to expect. I will learn. He nodded. Once. Pointed to a rope she hadn't noticed, anchored somewhere above them. Can you climb? Yes. Childhood in an orchard had given her, that much, at least, strength, and a head for heights, that would have scandalized Boston society down to its shoes. Then follow. He grasped the rope, and began ascending, with the same unhurried confidence he'd shown coming down. She took a breath, pushed every ache in her body, into a locked room at the back of her mind, and followed. They rode back to camp in a silence, that had changed shape, since the last time they'd shared a horse. Less fear in it now. More something else, something Cordelia did not yet have a word for, and was not, in this chapter of the story, ready to look at directly. Winona treated her wounds, without a word of reproach, though her muttering, "Foolish girl, desert not kind," carried enough disapproval for both of them combined. And that evening, Natoni came to the shelter, that was now, apparently, hers. Larger than the first. A promotion of sorts, or a change in category, captive to something else. Something without a name yet. He set down a bundle he'd carried back, from the ridge, where he'd found her. Salvage, he called it. Things scattered from her original wagon train, gathered by scouts in the days, since the attack, most of it burned beyond any use. "Why bring me this?" she asked, staring at the bundle like it might bite her. "Because it is yours," he said. "What is left of it?" She went through it, that night by firelight, because some things a person has to face alone, even when someone else is only a few feet away, sharpening an arrowhead, and pretending not to watch her do it. Silas's pocket watch, the glass cracked clean across. A ruined bonnet, the ribbon burned to a black thread. And near the bottom, a scrap of paper, half burned, the edges curled black, most of the ink gone to smear. She almost set it aside. Almost. Except something about the shape of what remained caught her eye. A seal. Partial. Wax that had melted, and reformed in the heat, but hadn't fully burned away, and pressed into it, unmistakable even in ruin, a mark, a mine shaft crossed, with a pickaxe, and beneath it, 3 letters still legible. C.A.L. Calloway. Her stomach dropped, through the floor of the shelter. Because that was not a stranger's name. That was a name, from her own kitchen table in Boston, from evenings when Silas would come home, from his investors' dinners talking about territory, and opportunity, and a man named Calloway, who had connections clear out to the Arizona line. A mining man. A man Silas had done business with, in the vague, gentlemanly way husbands did business, without troubling their wives, with the details, because that was simply how it was done, and she had never once thought to ask more. She was thinking about it now. Which meant this scrap, burned, half destroyed, salvaged from the wreckage of a wagon train, that had been attacked in the dead of night by men she'd been told were simply raiders, simply the wild country doing what wild country did, this scrap had no earthly reason to be lying in that sand. Unless someone connected to Calloway's business had been on that trail. Watching it. Perhaps arranging for it. Except that's impossible, she told herself. Except who would burn an entire wagon train to hide one shipment, one arrangement, one deal. Except why would that paper survive the fire at all, unless it wasn't in the fire, unless it was dropped after, unless. She stopped. Made herself breathe. Made herself think it, through the way Silas had taught her to think, through anything difficult, slowly, in order, without letting the fear get ahead of the facts. "You are quiet," Natoni said, without looking up, from the arrowhead. "I found something," she said. And then, because some instinct told her this was not, yet the moment to say what, exactly, that this was a thread, that needed pulling alone, first, before she handed it to anyone, even a man, who had just pulled her off a cliff, she added only, "Something of my husband's." It surprised me. He looked up then. Studied her face the way he studied tracks in the sand, patient, thorough, missing nothing. "Grief surprises," he said. "Even old grief. It waits, then finds new ground to stand on." She let him believe, that was all it was. For now. She folded the scrap of paper, into the spine of her journal, where no searching hand would think to look, and she lay awake long, after he had gone, until the smoke hole above her went, from black to gray, turning one single, terrible thought over and over. 3 moons. She had 3 moons to learn these people's language, their trust, their world. And now, apparently, she had 3 moons to find out, who had truly burned, that wagon train, and why the name of her dead husband's own business partner was sitting in the ashes of it, waiting for her, as if it had been left there on purpose. Outside, somewhere across the camp, she heard low voices in the dark. 2 men. She did not understand every word, yet, her grasp of the language was still young, still stumbling, but she understood enough of the tone to feel the hair rise on the back of her neck. One voice was patient. Familiar. Natoni's, low and even. The other was not patient at all. She could not make out the words. But she recognized the shape of the anger in them, because she had felt those same eyes on her at the stream, at the grinding stone, across the fire, a young warrior's gaze, that had never once softened toward her, not for a single hour, and never would. Whatever this bargain of 3 moons was going to cost her, she understood, lying there in the dark, with a burned scrap of paper hidden against her heart, it was not going to be paid only to the desert. Someone in this camp already wanted her gone. And somewhere beyond it, in an office, perhaps, with good carpets, and a ledger book, and a name she now recognized, someone else had wanted the whole wagon train gone in the first place. She closed her eyes. Did not sleep. And began, in the dark, to plan. His name was Chody. She learned it 3 days later, and she learned it the way you learn the name of a storm, after it has already touched down somewhere close enough to feel the wind of it. She was carrying water back, from the stream, the jar heavy against her hip, when he stepped into her path. Not blocking it entirely. Just enough. Just enough to make clear, that the choice to go around him was hers to make, and that he would be watching how she made it. White eyes, he said. Not a greeting. A label, flat and final, the way you'd name a tool, or a weapon. I have a name, she said. Steadier than she felt. Names are earned. His English was rougher than Natoni's, angrier at the edges, like he resented having to use it at all. You have not earned one. Not from me. I didn't ask you to give me one. His eyes narrowed, some surprise in them, that she'd answered at all instead of lowering her gaze, and moving past. He studied her a moment longer. Natoni brings you, into council fires soon, he said. I hear this. I hear he lets you sit near the elders, near the talk of soldiers and treaties. His jaw tightened. You know nothing of what it costs to lose land. To lose children. And still he lets you sit. I know what it costs to lose a husband, she said quietly. I know what it costs to lose everything you built a life around, in a single season, with no warning, and no mercy. She met his eyes, and did not let hers drop. It is not the same loss as yours. I would never claim it was. But do not tell me I know nothing of losing. For a moment, just a moment, something almost like respect crossed his face. Then it hardened, over again, quicker than it had come. Words, he said, echoing Natoni without seeming to know it, or perhaps knowing it perfectly well, and choosing the word, as a small, deliberate insult. Your kind is good with words. Good with paper. Good with promises written on paper, that mean nothing once the ink is dry. He stepped closer. Not touching her. Simply close enough, that she felt the full weight of the anger radiating off him like heat off stone. I have seen paper promises before. I watched what came after. Then you understand, she said carefully, why I would want to know, who is behind the paper. Before I trust it. That stopped him. He studied her for a long beat, something calculating moving behind the anger now, some recalibration she couldn't read. What do you mean, he said. Slower this time. She almost told him. The words were right there, crowding the back of her throat. There is a name in the ashes of my wagon train, a name I recognize, a name that has no business being anywhere near a raiding party, unless someone paid for it to be there, and some instinct, some cold, careful part of her, that had been growing, since the night of the fire, closed her mouth around them, before they could escape. Because she did not, yet know whose side Chody's anger actually served. Whether it was the pure, uncomplicated grief of a man who'd lost his family to soldiers, or whether there was something else moving underneath it. Something that might, if given the wrong piece of information at the wrong moment, use it in a way she could not, yet predict or control. Nothing, she said instead. Only that paper lies easily. And I would rather trust what I see, with my own eyes. Chody's eyes narrowed. He did not believe her, she could see that clearly enough, but he let it go, for now, with a short, sharp exhale that might have been disgust, or might have been something closer to grudging interest. Watch yourself, White Eyes, he said, stepping aside at last to let her pass. Natoni's kindness is not armor. It only covers what it covers, and it will not follow you, into whatever quiet corner he isn't standing in. She walked past him without answering. Did not look back. But she felt his eyes on her the whole way to her shelter, and she understood, with a clarity that settled cold and certain in her chest, that whatever careful trust she was building, with Natoni, whatever ground she was gaining, with Winona, with Kimamila, with the slow thaw of a camp that had wanted her dead 3 weeks ago, none of it extended to this man. And he was not the kind of man who let a grudge go quiet simply because it went unspoken. That night she sat alone, with the journal open on her knees, the burned scrap of paper still hidden in its spine, and she wrote by the failing light, until her hand cramped. I do not know, yet who set fire to that wagon train, she wrote. I do not know whether Calloway's hand reached all the way out here, or whether I am simply a grieving woman seeing conspiracy in a burned scrap, because the alternative, that it was only chance, only the ordinary cruelty of a hard country, is somehow worse to sit with. But I know this. There are now 2 fires I am standing inside of. One is the fire that took my husband's business partner's name, and left it in the sand, where it had no right to be. The other is the fire in a young warrior's eyes every time he looks at me, a fire that has nothing to do with paper, and everything to do with a grief I recognize, because I carry a version of it myself. 3 moons, she wrote, and underlined it, hard enough that the nib nearly tore the page. I do not know if that is enough time to learn a people's trust. I am beginning to suspect it may not be enough time to survive what is coming, regardless of what I learn. She closed the journal. Pressed it flat against her chest the way she had the night of the fire, as if the gesture alone might hold something together, that had already, quietly, begun to come apart. Outside, the camp settled into its ordinary night sounds. Dogs. Low voices. A child's laugh cut short by sleep. Somewhere beyond all of it, beyond the mountains, beyond the desert, beyond the reach of anything she could presently touch, or change, a man, with a mining seal, and a name she recognized was going about his business, entirely unaware that a burned scrap of paper had survived a fire he may, or may not have ordered, and had landed, of all the places in this vast, and indifferent territory, in the one pair of hands most likely to recognize it. She did not know, yet, what she intended to do with that. But she understood, lying awake as the fire outside burned down to embers, that she was no longer simply trying to survive her 3 moons. She was trying to find out the truth of how they had begun. Because if she was right, if the fire that took Amos Whitfield's life, and left her bound, and bleeding on the back of a stranger's horse had been lit by something other than chance, then the 3 moons Natoni had offered her were not simply a bargain between a captive and her captor. They were a window. A narrow, closing window, into a conspiracy, that had already cost her a husband's silence about his own business dealings, a wagon master's life, and very nearly her own. And somewhere on the other side of that window, whether she was ready for it, or not, someone was still counting on the fire having buried every last trace of what it had truly been sent to hide. She meant to prove them wrong. Time moved differently in the mountains. Cordelia noticed that, before she noticed almost anything else about her new life. Because in Boston, time had been measured in calling cards, and church bells, and the particular hour, when Silas used to come home smelling of ink and cold air. Out here it was measured in moons. In the color of the light on the canyon walls at dusk. In how far her grasp of the stone-wind tongue had come, since the last time she tried, and failed to say a word correctly. 4 months now. Since the fire. Her hands had stopped bleeding long ago. Had gone hard instead. Calloused in places that used to be soft, and she caught herself sometimes running her thumb over the new toughness there like she was reading a book written in a language only her own body understood. She was teaching now. Not officially. Nothing out here was official the way things had been official in Boston, with its diplomas, and its certificates, and its careful, suffocating rules about who was permitted to instruct whom. Out here she simply sat, with a cluster of children in the shade of a rock overhang, and drew letters in the dirt, with a stick, and they came back the next day, and the day after, because something in them wanted the shapes to mean something. This one, said a small girl named Little Wren, jabbing a finger at a crooked A, is like a mountain. 2 sides. Meeting at top. That's exactly right, Cordelia said, and meant it, because it was a better way of remembering the letter than any rule she'd ever taught a Boston schoolroom. She was, without quite deciding to be, becoming useful. Which was not the same as becoming trusted. She understood the difference now in a way she never had before. Usefulness bought tolerance. Trust was a different currency altogether, slower to earn, and far easier to lose, and she was still counting every coin of it she managed to collect. Natoni watched her teach sometimes. From a distance. Never close enough to be part of it, never far enough to pretend he wasn't paying attention. You give them something, he said once, after the children had scattered back toward their mothers. Not just words. Something under the words. A door, she said. That's what a good teacher gives. Not answers. A door, and the confidence to open it themselves. He turned that, over a long moment, the way he turned, over most things, slowly, like a stone he wanted to know the underside of. My mother said something close to this, he said finally. Long ago. It was the first time he'd offered, that memory unprompted. She did not push for more. She had learned, by now, that pushing closed doors, that patience would eventually open on its own. There was another kind of usefulness growing in her too. Quieter. Harder to name. One evening, an elder named Gray Fox brought a folded paper to the fire circle, a copy of a treaty document, salvaged from a trading post, its language dense, with the particular fog lawyers build, into contracts on purpose. He set it in front of her, without a word, only a question in his eyes. She read it twice. Slowly. The way Silas had taught her to read anything, that mattered, not for what it said, but for what it was careful not to say. This clause, she said, tapping a paragraph near the bottom, grants access to mineral rights. Here. Buried under 3 sentences about hunting privileges, so a man signing quickly would miss it entirely. Gray Fox's face did not change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. They did this before, he said. To others. We did not understand until land was gone. Then read everything, she said. Every line. Twice. And if a paper comes to you promising peace, ask what it promises to someone else first, because that is usually where the truth of it is hiding. Gray Fox nodded once, slow, and folded the paper away, with new care, as though it had become a different object than the one he'd carried to the fire, worth guarding now instead of merely reading. Natoni had watched the whole exchange, from a few feet off, arms crossed, saying nothing until Gray Fox had gone. He watched her a while longer before he finally spoke. You give more than letters to children, he said. I give what I have, Cordelia said. It isn't a rifle. It isn't a knife. But words on paper have killed more of your people than either, if what I understand of these treaties is true. So maybe words on paper can also save a few. He studied her for a long moment. My mother used to say the same. A pause, something almost like a smile at the edge of it. Perhaps this is why the old story exists. Perhaps this is why it keeps happening. What happens now? She asked. It happened on a morning that had given no warning of itself. Which was, Cordelia would come to understand, exactly how the worst mornings always arrived. Not with thunder. With ordinary light, ordinary birdsong, an ordinary bowl of cornmeal she never finished eating. The first sound was distant. A kind of low thunder, that wasn't thunder at all. Then the second sound was closer. Hooves. Many of them, and moving fast, and under the hoofbeats a rising ripple of shouting, that had nothing gentle in it at all. Raiders. Natoni's voice cut across the camp, before Cordelia had even fully understood what she was hearing. From the north. Take cover, now. Not their own people. A rival band, come down out of the high country the way storms came, without asking permission of anyone. Chaos arrived within seconds. Shelters caught fire. Women screamed and scattered, with children under each arm. Gunfire cracked somewhere close, and then closer, and Cordelia found herself pressed behind a cluster of boulders at the camp's edge, with Natoni's hand hard on her shoulder. Stay hidden, he ordered. If they find you, they take you. Or worse. What about? He was already gone. Rifle in hand, running back into the heart of the fighting, and there was no time left to finish the question. Cordelia crouched behind the rocks, pulse loud in her own ears, and made herself watch instead of hide her face from it. Because looking away wouldn't make it not be happening. Shelters burning. Women running with infants clutched to their chests. A dog's frantic barking cut suddenly, horribly short. This is what he tried to protect me from, she thought. This is what he lived through as a boy, watching from behind rocks of his own, a girl's hand in his, that would not stay warm much longer. The thought arrived whole, and unbidden and would not leave again for a long time. And through the smoke, half hidden beside a structure, that had already caught, she saw them. Children. A cluster of them. Separated from their mothers in the chaos. Cowering as the flames crept closer, and not one adult near enough to reach them in time. She did not decide to move. Her body simply moved, the decision arriving somewhere, after the fact, the way real courage always seems to. She sprinted across open ground. Bullets kicked up dust to her left, close enough that she felt the grit of it sting her cheek, and she did not stop, because stopping was the one option that guaranteed the worst outcome. Come with me, she called, reaching them, gathering the smallest, a girl of perhaps 4 summers, into her arms. Follow. Now. She switched to the stone-wind tongue, without thinking, the halting words she'd built, over 4 months of grinding corn, and trading language, with Kimamila by the stream, and something in her broken, urgent speech seemed to cut through the children's terror in a way pure panic alone had not. They fell in behind her. She knew a cave. From foraging trips, with Winona, weeks earlier, a narrow entrance behind a stand of scrub oak, easy to miss, unless you already knew exactly where to look. 7 children in all, by the time she counted them safely inside. From the smallest, still clutched against her chest, to a boy near 10 summers, who had appointed himself, without being asked, the one responsible for keeping the younger ones quiet. Stay deep, she told them, pressing a finger to her lips. I watch. Hours passed. She told them stories in a whispered mixture of English, and their own tongue, half-remembered fairy tales, half-remembered legends Winona had shared with her, until the youngest ones drifted into an exhausted, fitful sleep. Then hoofbeats. Close. Through the brush she saw them. 5 mounted raiders, scanning the hillside, with the kind of patience that meant they were not simply passing through. One pointed directly at the scrub oak concealing the cave mouth. Cordelia's hand closed around a fist-sized rock. Pitiful, against rifles. But it was the only thing the cave floor had offered her, and she would use it, because the alternative was doing nothing, while 7 children were found. "Stay with the others," she whispered to the oldest boy. "If they find us, run. Deeper. There may be another way out." The first raider reached the scrub oak. Pushed the branches aside with his rifle barrel. Cordelia pressed herself flat against the wall, rock clutched to her chest, heart hammering so loud she was certain it would give them all away on its own. She counted her own heartbeats, because it was the only thing left to count. 1. 2. Because if she stopped counting she would start thinking about what came, after the branches parted all the way, and thinking about, that would undo whatever thin nerve she had left. Behind her, one of the smaller children stirred, whimpered. She reached back, without turning, found a small hand in the dark, squeezed it once. Steady. Because if the children heard fear in her breathing, they would find it in their own next, and there would be nothing left to hold the silence together at all. A shout, from somewhere else on the ridge, turned the raiders' heads. They conferred. Briefly. Then wheeled their horses, and rode off along the ridgeline, continuing whatever sweep had brought them this close in the first place. She did not move for a full minute, after the hoofbeats faded. Waited. Because the frontier had taught her, in 4 months, that the moment right, after danger passes is the moment most people make the mistake, that kills them. Cordelia let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Her whole body shook, with the release of it. But the danger wasn't over. Little Wren, because of course it was Little Wren, small and stubborn, and clinging to Cordelia's side, through all of it, had begun to run a fever, likely from fear, and the cave's damp chill. And the youngest children would not last much longer without food. "I need to find help," Cordelia told the oldest boy. "You're in charge until I return. What if they come back?" She showed him a narrow crevice at the back of the cave. Too small for a grown man to follow. "Hide everyone there. Wait for me." She slipped out. Moved low, careful, using every instinct Natoni had spent weeks drilling, into her without her fully realizing it was training at the time. A hand closed over her mouth from behind. She fought it. Twisted. Struck backward with her elbow, before a voice, low, urgent, unmistakably familiar, hissed against her ear. "Quiet. Scout still near." Natoni. Relief hit her, so hard her knees nearly gave. He released her. Blood streaked one shoulder, where a wound had opened, and gone half-dried in the sun. "The children," she said, the words tumbling out fast. 7 of them. In a cave behind the scrub oak. Little Wren has fever. They need help now. He went still, something behind his eyes he clearly hadn't expected to feel there. "You took them to safety." "I couldn't leave them to burn." She said it like it was obvious. Because to her, in that moment, it had been. He nodded once. "Decision made. Show me. We bring them home." They returned in 2 groups, for safety. Natoni took the 4 oldest children. Cordelia followed with Little Wren, and the 2 youngest boys, moving slow and careful, through the tree line, until the battered, but standing camp finally came into view. Mothers rushed forward. Cries of relief. Children gathered into arms, that had spent the last hours believing the worst. Little Wren, fever and all, would not let go of Cordelia's neck. Small arms locked, with a strength that had no business belonging to someone, so small and so sick. "You came back," the child whispered. In the old tongue. In the language Cordelia had spent 4 months fighting to earn. "Of course," Cordelia said, and her throat closed around the words. "I promised, didn't I?" Kimamila found her through the crowd. Face streaked with soot, unharmed, and her whole expression shifted the moment she took in the scene: Cordelia, little Wren clinging to her, Natoni standing close, protective. "You saved them," Kimamila said. Simple. Final. Word moved through the camp faster than smoke. The white woman had protected their children. Had risked her own life, without hesitating, without calculating what it would cost her, without once asking what she would get in return. Where there had been suspicion, there were now nods. Where there had been silence, there were now murmured words of thanks in a language that, 4 months ago, would have meant nothing to her at all. Not everyone's manner toward her changed. Chody stood at the edge of the gathering. Arms folded. Watching the scene, with an expression Cordelia could not fully read, not hostility exactly, not this time, but something wary, and unresolved, as if the ground he'd been standing on had just shifted under him, and he had not yet decided how he felt about that. That evening, washing blood and dirt from her hands in the stream, Cordelia found Natoni beside her. "First fight is hardest," he said quietly. "I didn't fight. You fought for children's lives." His voice carried no argument in it, only fact. Different weapon than gun or knife. Still fighting. "I was terrified," she admitted. "The whole time. I kept thinking they would find us." Courage is not absence of fear. He looked out across the darkening valley. It is action despite fear. Many warriors brave when strong. Few brave when weak, and afraid, and still choose right thing. The plain honesty of it settled into her, warm against a long cold day. "What happens now?" she asked. "We rebuild." Simple, the way he made most difficult things sound simple, though she understood by now that simplicity was not the same as ease. "We honor dead. We continue." "And my 3 moons?" He turned to look at her directly, the last light catching in eyes that had, over 4 months, become something other than the eyes of a stranger. "Clock stops in battle," he said. "But choice remains yours. When time comes." 2 days after the raid, while helping sort through salvage recovered from the fighting, weapons dropped by fleeing attackers, supplies abandoned in the chaos, Cordelia found the second piece. A satchel. Leather, good quality, the kind a trader or an army scout would carry, not the kind that belonged to raiders traveling light and fast. Inside it, folded carefully, a set of maps. And on the back of one of them, stamped in the same ink, the same unmistakable shape, a mine shaft crossed, with a pickaxe. Cal. Her hands went cold despite the afternoon heat. This is not a coincidence, she told herself. Except coincidences do not carry a company seal folded into a stranger's map case. Except a raiding party from the north has no earthly reason to be carrying documents belonging to a Boston mining venture, unless someone paid them to be here, unless someone is using every hand available, raiders, soldiers, whoever will take the money, to clear this land by whatever method works fastest. She sat very still, the map trembling slightly in her hands, and let the full shape of it settle over her. Because if Calloway's mark was on the wagon train ambush that had taken her from Boston, and if Calloway's mark was now on maps carried by raiders attacking this camp, then this was not one crime. It was a pattern. A method. A man, somewhere far from any of this violence, sitting comfortably behind a desk, while other men's hands did the burning. And Silas, she thought, and the thought arrived like a slap, unwelcome and impossible to unthink once it had landed. Silas did business with this man. Silas trusted this man. What did Silas know, at the end, that he never told me? She folded the map away, with hands that would not quite stop shaking, and did not sleep, that night, and did not tell Natoni. Not yet. Because some part of her, the careful, frightened, calculating part that had kept her alive, since the night of the fire, understood, that once she said this thing out loud, once she handed this thread to someone else, she would lose the ability to decide, alone, what to do with it. So she sat instead, with the journal open, and the two scraps of evidence side by side. The burned seal from the wagon train. The stamped map from the raiders. And she made herself do the thing Silas had always insisted was the difference between a frightened mind and a useful one. She made herself write down only what she actually knew, nothing more. 1. Calloway's mark was on my wagon train's attackers, or near enough to them, that his paper burned in the same fire. 2. Calloway's mark is now on maps carried by men who tried to burn this camp. 3. 2 attacks. 2 different kinds of raiders. 1 shared name behind both. She stopped. Read it back. Made herself sit, with how impossible it sounded, and how, despite that, she did not disbelieve a word of it. Which means someone is paying whoever will take the money, she thought. Which means this was never simply wild country doing what wild country does. Which means Silas, my Silas, who read Seneca to me every night, and never once raised his voice in 10 years of marriage, sat across a dinner table, from a man capable of this, and called him a friend, and I never asked a single question, because a wife did not ask questions about her husband's business in Boston, and God help me, I wish I had asked every one of them. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, until the shaking in them finally slowed. Later, she told herself. Grief later. Right now, only the facts matter. Right now, only staying alive long enough to use them matters. Kimamila came to her 3 nights later. Sat close, in the dim light of the shelter, and did not speak for a long while, which was unlike her. Something troubles you, Cordelia said finally. Something troubles you too, Kimamila answered. I see it. Weeks now. Cordelia said nothing. I must tell you a thing, Kimamila said, and her voice had gone smaller than Cordelia had ever heard it. Chody asked me. After first weeks. To watch you. To tell him what you say, what you write in, that book you hide. The words landed like cold water. And did you? At first. Kimamila would not meet her eyes. I was afraid of him. Everyone is a little afraid of him. A pause. But I stopped telling him true things. Weeks ago. I told him nothing that mattered. Why are you telling me this now? Because friend does not keep secret, that could hurt friend. Kimamila finally looked up, and there were tears standing in her eyes, unshed, fierce with the effort of not falling. You saved little Wren. My cousin's daughter. You did not have to. I watched you choose it. Her jaw tightened. I choose you now. Fully. No more watching for him. Cordelia felt something in her chest crack open, not pain exactly. Relief, maybe, tangled up with something rawer. Thank you, she said. For telling me. That took courage. Do not thank me. Kimamila shook her head. Thank yourself. You earned this trust. I only finally gave what was already yours. Should have given it sooner. That is on me, not you. They sat together a long while after that, in a silence that had nothing uncomfortable left in it. But Cordelia lay awake again, that night, turning the new information over beside the old. Chody wanted her watched. Chody's anger ran deeper than grief alone accounted for. And somewhere beyond this camp, a man named Calloway was quietly funding violence on 2 fronts, months apart, hundreds of miles apart, and she was, as far as she knew, the only living person who had pieced together that both fronts bore his mark. Except what if I am not the only one, who knows, she thought, the idea arriving cold and sudden. Except what if Chody's anger is not only grief? Except what if someone has already found a use for it? She did not yet have proof of that. But the shape of the fear had found her, and it would not leave again. The council met 8 days later, in the wake of scouts returning, with news that unsettled even the calmest elders. A new army outpost. 2 days' ride from their territory. Soldiers arriving daily, and with them, rumor of a mining survey team already working the hills near a place the elders called simply the Red Canyon. Ember Canyon. Cordelia had heard the name, before. Silas had mentioned it once, in passing, at a dinner table in Boston, in the careless way men mention business, that will never touch their wives' lives. Calloway thinks there's real money in a canyon out west, he'd said, refilling his glass, already moving on to some other topic, before she could ask a single question. She had not thought of that comment in months. She thought of nothing else now. Natoni called the council to order. To Cordelia's surprise, and to the visible fury of several older warriors, he invited her to sit within it. "You know White Eye's thinking," he said, by way of explanation to the gathered elders. "Your words may help us see the path forward." "White Witch comes to poison council, with sweet lies," Chody said, loud enough for the whole circle to hear, not bothering to disguise his contempt. "She sits in council by my word," Natoni said, and his voice went flat, and hard in a way Cordelia had not heard before. "Challenge that." "You challenge me." Silence answered him. Chody did not challenge it further. But his eyes found Cordelia across the fire, and held there, and she understood, that whatever fragile truce had grown between them over the raid, and its aftermath had just been spent, entirely, in this one moment. The debate that followed ran for hours. Fight. Flee to the mountains. Or seek terms. Treaty, Chody spat, when the word was raised. White Eye's treaties are written on water. They promise peace today. Break it tomorrow. He turned, pointing at Cordelia. Ask her. She knows their ways. All eyes turned to her. It's true that many treaties have been broken, she said carefully, meeting Chody's gaze, and not flinching from it. But not all white men are the same. Just as not all your people are the same. A breath. Some genuinely believe in peace. I have seen it. I have also seen the ones who don't, the ones who use peace as a word to hide behind, while they do something else entirely. She did not say the name Calloway. Not yet. Not without more than a burned scrap of paper, and a stamped map to back it. But something in the way she said it made Natoni look at her sharply, as though he'd heard the shape of something she hadn't said aloud. She speaks careful words, Chody said, low, to the men nearest him, though loud enough to carry. Careful words hide careful lies. Or careful truth, Gray Fox said, not looking up, from the fire. You confuse the two, because it is easier to trust your anger than to trust anything new. Chody's jaw worked. He said nothing further to that. But Cordelia felt his eyes on her for the rest of the council, weighing, calculating, the way a man weighs an enemy he has not yet decided how to remove. The council broke near dawn, without a final decision. But a fragile consensus was forming, prepare for conflict, while quietly testing whether peace was possible at all. It was 3 nights later, that Cordelia could not sleep, and went walking near the edge of camp for air, that didn't smell like smoke, and old fear, and heard voices near the horse enclosure, that made her stop dead in the dark. 2 men. Low. Careful. One she recognized instantly, Chody, his voice unmistakable even at a whisper. The other was not one of her people at all. She crept closer, staying low, every lesson Natoni had drilled into her without calling it training now paying for itself in full. Through the gap in a fence rail, she saw them. Chody. And a white man in a captain's coat, a canteen slung across his shoulder, speaking in a voice pitched to carry no further than the 2 of them. The peace talks give us the cover we need, the officer was saying. Colonel comes with only 3 men. Easy enough to make it look like your people's treachery, once it's done. Calloway gets his canyon. You get your war. Cordelia's whole body went cold, and still, the way it had gone cold, and still the night of the fire. Doyle, she thought. She'd heard the name once, in passing, from a scout describing the new outpost. Captain Doyle. Which means this is not some rogue trader chasing a bounty. Which means the army itself, or a piece of it, at least, is already rotten, from the inside, before a single treaty has even been signed. And the woman, Chody said. She knows something. I feel it. Then make sure she doesn't get the chance to say it. The officer's voice was flat. Businesslike, in a way, that made the words worse, not better. One way or another. Cordelia did not wait to hear more. She backed away, from the fence rail, with her heart slamming, so hard against her ribs she was certain the sound alone would give her away, and she did not stop moving, until she was well clear of the enclosure, breath coming ragged, mind racing far ahead of her feet. Calloway, she thought. Except it isn't only Calloway anymore. Except there is an army officer standing in the dark, planning to burn a peace conference down around a colonel, who trusts him. Except Chody, whose grief I understood, whose anger I tried to make room for, Chody is standing right beside him, agreeing to it. She thought of little Wren's small arms locked around her neck. Of Kimamila's fierce, unshed tears. Of Natoni's hand steady on her shoulder in the smoke, telling her to run. And now I know, she thought, the fear and the fury braiding together, into something colder, and more useful than either alone. Now I know what's coming. The only question left is whether I can reach Natoni, before it does. She ran the rest of the way back, through the dark camp, the burned scrap of paper, and the stamped map both burning now in her mind like twin coals, that would not go out, carrying with her the one piece of knowledge, that might be the only thing standing between this fragile, hard-won peace and a fire far larger than the one, that had first brought her here. She reached Natoni's shelter, and stopped outside it, hand raised to the entrance flap, and did not go in. Because once I say this, she thought, there is no unsaying it. Because Chody will know I heard, the moment Natoni acts on what I tell him. Because a man, who is already planning to burn a peace conference to the ground will not hesitate, over one more fire, if that fire is me. Except staying silent is worse. Except silence is exactly what Doyle asked for, and I will not give that man one single thing he asked for. She pushed the flap aside and went in. Natoni looked up, from where he sat sharpening a blade by low firelight, and whatever he saw in her face made him set the blade down at once. Something has happened, he said. Not a question. Everything has happened, she said, and her voice did not shake, though everything underneath it did. I need you to listen to all of it. From the beginning. Because by the time I finish, you are going to understand exactly why I could not tell you sooner, and exactly why we no longer have the luxury of waiting. He did not speak. He simply moved to sit across, from her, close enough that the firelight caught both their faces at once, and waited. She began with the fire, that took the wagon train. She ended with the two men standing in the dark by the horse enclosure, agreeing, in low and businesslike voices, on the shape of a massacre still 3 days from happening. When she finished, the fire between them had burned down to embers, and neither of them moved to build it back up. 3 moons, Natoni said finally, very quiet. I offered you 3 moons to learn our ways. He looked at her, and something in his face had changed permanently, in the space of one telling. Instead you have spent 4 months learning to save us. 3 days. That was all the calendar had left to give them, before the peace conference at Ember Canyon, and every hour of it now felt like a coin Cordelia couldn't stop spending. The council met again at dawn. Smaller this time. Natoni. Gray Fox. 2 scouts who had proven themselves quiet and reliable. And Cordelia, seated close enough to the fire, that its heat kept her hands from shaking, because her hands had wanted to shake, since the night at the horse enclosure, and had not fully stopped since. We cannot accuse Chody outright, Gray Fox said. Not without proof the whole council will believe. He has followers. An accusation without proof splits us exactly when we cannot afford splitting. Then we get proof, Cordelia said. How? We let the trap think it's still working. She looked at Natoni. Send warriors to the canyon early, the way we already planned. But this time we know what they're watching for isn't only soldiers hiding in the rocks. It's Doyle's men, positioned to make an ambush look like your people's treachery. If we see them getting into position before the colonel even arrives, we have proof no one can argue with. Natoni studied her for a long moment. And if we are wrong? If this is only fear talking? Then we've lost nothing but caution, she said. And if we're right? Then we save the colonel's life, Natoni finished. And expose our own man, as a traitor to his people, in front of every warrior, who still believes he only wants war for the right reasons. Silence settled over the circle. Because that was the true cost of it, and everyone in the fire's light understood it plainly. Whatever happened at Ember Canyon in 3 days would not simply resolve a conspiracy. It would tear something open inside the people themselves, and there would be no quiet way to close it again afterward. Cordelia sat with that thought a long moment. Because exposing Chody in front of the whole council risks the very unity we need to survive this. Except staying silent risks Colonel Bishop's life, and every warrior, who trusts Natoni's word, that peace is even possible. Except there is no version of this, where everyone walks away whole. There never was, not from the night the fire first started. Do it, Natoni said finally. Send Stone Elk and 2 others tonight. Watch. Do not engage, unless there is no other choice. The scouts left, before the fire had fully burned down. Cordelia sat a while longer, watching the coals, and felt Natoni's presence settle beside her, without either of them speaking. You are afraid, he said, after a while. Not a question. An observation, offered plainly, the way he offered most true things. Terrified, she admitted. Not of dying. I think I stopped being afraid of that somewhere on that ledge, the day you found me. I'm afraid of being wrong. Of sending Stone Elk into danger over a suspicion that turns out to be nothing but a grieving woman seeing conspiracies in burned paper. And if you are wrong, then I would rather be wrong and cautious than right and silent, she said. I learned that lesson the hard way already. I don't intend to learn it twice. You did not have to tell me any of this, he said eventually. You could have taken what you knew, and used it only to buy your own safety. I thought about it, she admitted. Because it was true, and because she had promised herself, somewhere in the last 4 months, that she would stop hiding true things from him. For about the length of one bad night. Then I remembered little Wren's arms around my neck. And I understood I didn't actually have a choice at all. Not one I could live with. He said nothing to that. But his hand found hers in the dark, briefly, and did not need to say anything at all. The morning of the conference arrived pale, and still, the kind of stillness that always seems, in hindsight, like the land itself had known something was coming, and simply chose not to warn anyone. Cordelia rode with the delegation. Natoni had argued against it, briefly, and without much conviction, because he already knew what her answer would be, before he finished raising the objection. If Doyle sees me, she said, he sees a woman he thinks is still afraid of him. That's useful. Let him believe it a little longer. And if he decides you are more useful dead than afraid, then you'll be standing close enough to make that a very short-lived decision. He did not smile. But something in his jaw eased, just slightly, at that. Colonel Bishop arrived precisely on time, with exactly 3 men, as promised, and an expression that read, to Cordelia's careful eye, like a man who had no idea he was walking into anything but an ordinary negotiation. Weather-beaten. Steady eyes. The kind of face that had seen 20 years of frontier, and hadn't yet let it curdle into cruelty. Doyle stood at his shoulder. Composed. Unbothered. A man wearing his own betrayal like a well-fitted coat, the kind tailored, so carefully that no one else in the room could see the seams. The talk began the way such talks always began, careful words, translated words, words weighed twice, before they left anyone's mouth. Cordelia stood near enough to translate, where needed, watching Doyle's hands, his eyes, the small tells of a man waiting for a signal only he expected to see. Watch his fingers, she told herself. Because a man about to signal an ambush cannot help but check his position against the sun, against the ridge, against the men he's counting on. Watch. Because if I miss the signal, Bishop dies believing he was among friends. It came from the ridge above them. A glint. Metal, catching sun. Now, Natoni said, low, to the men beside him. Chaos arrived all at once. Doyle's hidden rifleman broke, from the rocks above, the very men Stone Elk had spotted 2 nights earlier, positioned exactly where Cordelia's warning said they would be. Shots cracked across the canyon. Colonel Bishop's face went, from confusion to horror in the space of a single heartbeat, as he understood, far too late, that his own captain had walked him into a slaughter. Doyle, what is this? Nothing personal, Colonel. Doyle's voice had gone cold, businesslike, the same voice Cordelia had heard in the dark by the horses. Just progress. Chody broke from the line at the same moment, mounted, moving toward the chaos, with a fury that had clearly been waiting weeks for permission to arrive. Traitor, he shouted, not at Doyle. At Natoni. You bring us here to die for your white woman's peace. You brought us here to die for your gold, Natoni answered, and the accusation landed across the canyon like a second gunshot. I know what you agreed to. In the dark. By the horses. Chody's face went, through disbelief, then fury, then something that looked almost like relief, the relief of a secret finally, violently exposed, no longer requiring the effort of hiding. Then it ends now, he said, and drew his knife. They fought in the open, in full view of soldiers and warriors alike, and Cordelia watched, with her heart in her throat, because there was nothing left for her to do in that particular fight except witness it, and hope her instincts about Natoni had been right. Blade against blade. Both men moving, with a speed that made the watching soldiers go still despite the gunfire still cracking somewhere behind them. Chody fought with rage. Natoni fought with something colder, more precise, a man who had learned long ago that rage gets you killed faster than it gets you anything else. Don't look away, Cordelia told herself, even as every instinct screamed at her to. Because if he falls, you need to know it the instant it happens. Because there will be no time to catch up on what you missed. Elsewhere in the canyon, Doyle had gone for his pistol. Cordelia did not think. She simply moved, the way she'd moved toward the burning children weeks earlier, closing the distance, before her mind had fully caught up to her legs. She collided with him just as the shot fired wide, and they went down together in the dust, and his hands found her throat, before she could recover her breath. You meddling, his grip tightened. You've ruined everything. Darkness edged her vision. She clawed at his face, fingernails finding his eye, and he recoiled, with a howl, hands releasing her throat to clutch at the wound. She rolled free. Gasping. And saw his dropped pistol in the dust between them. They both lunged. Her fingers closed around it first. Don't move, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect, given how hard her whole body was shaking underneath the words. You won't shoot, Doyle said, one eye streaming blood, the other fixed on her, with something between contempt and disbelief. Proper ladies don't have the stomach. I stopped being a proper lady the night your friend's fire took a wagon train, and left me for someone else to finish killing. She did not blink. Test me again and find out. He lunged anyway. She pulled the trigger. The shot took him in the shoulder. He went down hard, and this time did not try to rise. Across the canyon, Natoni drove his blade home, and Chody looked down at it, with an expression of pure disbelief, before he slumped forward, still, and the fighting around them staggered to a ragged, uncertain halt as both sides understood, almost simultaneously, that the shape of the battle had just changed entirely. Colonel Bishop stood in the center of it, rifle still raised, staring at his own bleeding captain, with the particular horror of a man realizing he had trusted exactly the wrong person for exactly the wrong reasons. "Explain," he said. "To Doyle. To Cordelia. To anyone. Explain this. Now." It was Cordelia who answered, because she was the only one in that canyon who had every piece of the picture. "There's gold in this canyon, Colonel. A mining company back east has been paying for it in blood for longer than anyone here realized. My own wagon train, months ago. This camp, weeks ago. And today, you." She kept the pistol steady, kept her voice steadier still, because falling apart could come later, after this was finished. "The company's name is Calloway. And I believe, though I cannot yet prove it fully, that this isn't the first time that name has cost someone I loved everything they had." Doyle, bleeding into the dust, laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Believe whatever you like. It changes nothing. The frontier is closing whether you understand it or not." "Bind him," Natoni said, approaching, blood on his own hands now too, none of it his. "He answers to his colonel's justice. Not to a bullet in this canyon." Cordelia lowered the pistol slowly, her arms trembling now, with the delayed weight of everything that had just happened. Around her the canyon had gone eerily quiet, the way ground always goes quiet, after violence finishes, with it, birds and wind resuming, as though nothing at all had occurred, though everything had. She looked at Natoni across the settling dust, blood-streaked, breathing hard, and understood without either of them saying it, that something between them had just been tested in the plainest way possible, and had not broken. They found the letters in his coat, that evening, back at the fort, once Colonel Bishop had placed him formally under arrest. Correspondence. Careful, businesslike, exactly the sort of letters a careful, businesslike man would write, and then regret not burning. And in one of them, dated 8 months earlier, Cordelia realized with a cold drop in her stomach, 3 weeks before Silas's fever had finally taken him, a line that undid something in her she had not known was still standing. "Winslow grows suspicious of the western shipments," the letter read, in handwriting she recognized instantly, because she had seen that same hand on 100 invitations to 100 Boston dinners. "His illness gives us time. See that his physician is delayed. A man too weak to ask questions is a man who cannot interfere with what comes next." Calloway's hand. Calloway's ink. Calloway's decision, made calmly, at a desk, months before she had ever seen the mountains, that would eventually take everything else, from her too. She sat with the letter a long time, before she could make herself speak. Her hands had gone cold around the paper, the way they'd gone cold around the burned scrap in the ashes months ago, except this time the cold went all the way to the center of her chest, and stayed there. "He was dying slowly enough, that I thought it was simply cruel luck," she thought. Except it was never luck. Except someone made a decision, at a desk, with clean hands, and a full night's sleep, that my husband's questions were worth less than a shipment of ore. Except I sat beside his bed for 6 weeks telling myself I had done everything a wife could do, and the whole time, the one thing that might have saved him was being deliberately kept from him by a man who called himself a friend. "He didn't just fund the fire that took my wagon train," she said finally, to Natoni, her voice very quiet, very level, the way a voice goes when the person speaking has decided not to let it break. "He delayed my husband's medicine. On purpose. Because Silas was asking questions Calloway didn't want answered." She looked up. "My whole journey west, the fresh start, the widow rebuilding her life in open country, he used it as cover. For all of this. Natoni said nothing for a long moment. Then, quietly, then this was never only about land. Or gold. Or peace. No, Cordelia said. It was about a man deciding other people's lives were simply the cost of doing his business. And I intend to make sure the cost finally lands on him instead. How do you intend to do that? He asked. He sits in an office far from any arrow or bullet. With the same weapon I've been using since the night of the fire, she said. Paper. Truth, written down, sent to the right hands. Colonel Bishop has more reach than any rifle in this canyon. And I have proof now that even Boston can't ignore. She folded the letter carefully back into its envelope, her hands steadier now than they'd been minutes before. He hid behind other men's hands for the killing. He won't be able to hide behind mine when I'm the one holding the evidence. Colonel Bishop returned 3 days later with more than an apology. I owe you my life, Mrs. Winslow, he said, standing before the assembled council, with a formality that seemed, for the first time, entirely earned rather than performed. And I owe your people, a nod to Natoni, far more than a life. Doyle was not acting alone. His letters implicate a mining consortium reaching clear to the territorial governor's office. I intend to see every one of them exposed. Why should we trust any white man's word now? Natoni asked. Not hostile. Simply honest. You shouldn't, Bishop said. Trust is earned, not given. But I've spent 20 years on this frontier, and I've buried more good men than I care to count on both sides of it. I believe there's a path that doesn't require your destruction or your surrender. I intend to spend what's left of my career proving it. The negotiations that followed were unlike anything the territory had seen. Cordelia served as translator, and something more, a bridge built out of 2 languages, and 2 kinds of grief, both of which she now understood, from the inside. The final treaty granted the people a reservation encompassing their sacred sites and traditional hunting grounds. Ember Canyon included, its gold placed under strict protections that would take an act of open theft, not quiet paperwork, to ever unravel. Washington won't like parts of this, Bishop admitted, reviewing the final document. Especially the mineral clauses. Then Washington can explain to the newspapers why it prefers gold to a colonel's own life, Cordelia said. I believe reporters would find that story rather compelling. Bishop's mouth twitched, almost a smile. Remind me never to negotiate against you, Mrs. Winslow. You're not the one who should worry, she said. Calloway is. The signing itself took place 3 days later, on ground chosen jointly by both sides, a flat stretch near the stream, where children had once thrown stones at Cordelia's shadow, and now ran freely between soldiers' boots, without anyone reaching for a weapon. Gray Fox spoke first, in the old tongue, a long and careful accounting of everything the treaty promised, and everything it did not, so that no one gathered could later claim ignorance of its terms. Bishop spoke after him, in English, and Cordelia translated both directions at once, her voice the single thread holding 2 languages, 2 histories, and 2 very different kinds of hope together in the same afternoon. When the last signature dried, Natoni turned to her, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. 5 months ago, he said finally, I bound your wrists on this same ground, more or less. Different season. Same earth. I noticed, Cordelia said. I don't think either of us could have predicted where we'd be standing today. No, he agreed. But I think my mother would have. Cordelia had never met the woman. Only heard her name spoken like a small kept flame, passed carefully from Winona to Natoni, and now, in fragments, to her. But she thought, standing there, that she understood her a little now, a woman, who had crossed the same impossible distance, in the opposite season of her own life, and had found, on the far side of it, a reason to stay, that no letter home could ever fully explain. He was quiet a moment, and then said the thing she realized, standing there, she had been half waiting for him to say. "Your 3 moons ended long ago," he said. "You know this." "I know it," she said. "You never asked to leave, when the time came." "Never once." "No," she said. "I didn't." "Why?" She looked at him, at the man, who had bound her wrists on this ground 5 months earlier, at the fire, and the desert, and the 4 months of moons, that had passed since, at everything the two of them had built out of ashes neither of them had chosen. "Because somewhere in those 3 moons," she said, "I stopped counting the days, until I could leave, and started counting the days, until I'd see you again instead. I didn't notice the exact moment it happened. Only that by the time I might have noticed, it had already happened." He said nothing for a long moment. Then let us make it a choice spoken in front of everyone. Not simply a bargain, that quietly stopped being one. Edmund arrived at the fort a week after the treaty's signing, having traveled at a pace that had clearly cost him sleep and nerve in equal measure. His reunion with Cordelia took place at the trading post, that served as neutral ground between fort and reservation, and it began the way such reunions always begin, with an embrace too fierce for words, and words, when they finally came, too clumsy for how much they were trying to hold. "My God, Cordy." He held her at arm's length, taking in the sun-darkened skin, the changed way she stood, the particular new steadiness in her eyes. "I hardly recognize you. Are you well? Have they treated you?" "I'm well, Edmund. Better than well." She caught his hands, before he could finish reaching for his own conclusions. "Breathe. Let me explain, before you decide what you think happened to me." He listened. All of it, the fire, the bargain, the raid, the cave, the letter with Calloway's hand on it. By the end his face had gone, through several colors she didn't have names for. "He killed Silas," Edmund said, flat with disbelief. "A man we both sat across from at dinner. He killed him, and used your grief, as cover." "Yes. And you want to stay here? After everything he tried to take from you?" "I'm not staying, because of what he took," Cordelia said. "I'm staying because of what I built, while I was surviving it." She held her brother's gaze steadily. "There's someone, Edmund. His name is Natoni. He's the tribe's leader. The one who could have let me die a dozen times, over and chose, every time, not to." Edmund sat down heavily on a nearby bench, the weight of it all finally settling. "You're not coming back." "Not to live," she said gently. "But I would welcome your visits. There's much you could contribute here, irrigation, engineering, the kind of practical work this land actually needs, instead of another company looking to take from it." A ghost of a smile found his tired face. "Always the practical one. Even mid-revolution of your entire life." "Someone has to be," she said. It certainly wasn't going to be Silas. He could argue philosophy for 3 hours, and forget to eat dinner. Edmund laughed, a short, surprised sound, the first real one, since he'd arrived. "God, I'd forgotten that about him." "I hadn't," Cordelia said quietly. "I don't think I ever will. But I've learned something out here, Edmund. Loving him doesn't require me to stop living. It only requires me to carry him with me while I do." Her brother reached for her hand, and held it a long moment, and said nothing more, because nothing more needed saying. The meeting between Edmund and Natoni that afternoon was a study in two men measuring each other honestly, without pretense, because pretense would have insulted them both. "I understand you intend to marry my sister," Edmund said. "In our way, we already are," Natoni answered. "Her ceremony of choosing will make it whole, before your people's eyes too, if she wishes it." Edmund studied him a long moment. "Take care of her." "She does not need taking care of," Natoni said. "She has proven that in front of soldiers and warriors both. I only intend to stand beside her, while she continues proving it. Fair enough, Edmund said, and something in his posture eased for the first time, since he'd stepped off the road that morning. For what it's worth, Silas would have liked you. He never trusted a man who agreed with him too easily. You'd have argued with him about something, within the hour, I imagine. Then I am sorry I never had the chance, Natoni said. A man who taught your sister to think the way she thinks was clearly worth arguing with. It was, Edmund would admit to Cordelia much later, exactly the answer he hadn't known he needed to hear. The ceremony took place beneath a sky Cordelia had, 5 months earlier, believed to be nothing but cold and indifferent. It did not feel indifferent now. She stood at the center of the gathered circle in a dress that belonged fully to neither of her two worlds and, because of that, belonged completely to her, Boston cut, beadwork stitched along the hem by Kimamila's own hands, her hair loose the way it had been the night the fire took everything else, except now the looseness was a choice instead of a casualty. Gray Fox presided, the whole camp gathered in a wide circle around the fire. Questions were asked in the old language, and Kimamila translated softly at her side, though by now Cordelia understood most of the words on her own. Did she renounce her old life? No, she honored it, even as she stepped beyond it. Did she embrace this one fully, its duties, its dangers, its unbroken bond to the people gathered here? Yes. With a full heart. Winona stepped forward, with ochre and herb, painting symbols onto Cordelia's hands and face, marks of belonging, of protection, of an identity that had not existed 5 months ago, and now felt more true than any name she had carried before it. From this day, Gray Fox pronounced, you are no longer only Cordelia Winslow. You are Altsoba. First light. For you brought a new dawn to how our people are seen, and how we chose, in turn, to see. The name settled over her like something that had been waiting, patiently, for her to finally arrive at it. Little Wren pressed a small necklace of shell beads into her hands. Now you family, the child said simply. Stay forever. I intend to, Cordelia told her, kneeling so they were eye to eye. You were part of why I chose this, you know. You and 6 other children in a dark cave, trusting a stranger, because there was no one else left to trust. Little Wren considered this, with the particular seriousness only children bring to matters they've decided are important. Not stranger anymore, she said, and ran off, before Cordelia could answer, satisfied she'd settled the matter for good. That night, in the shelter, that had become entirely theirs, Natoni placed a final gift into her hands, a new journal, bound in soft deerskin, its cover marked, with symbols of protection. For new stories, he said. Old book carried you through fire. New book carries what comes after. She held it against her chest, the way she had held the first one the night the fire took everything else, and understood, finally, that this was not an ending to that night at all. It was the answer to it. Outside, the fire that had once meant only loss now simply meant home, warmth against a mountain chill, light enough to read by, the ordinary center of an ordinary evening, that had no business feeling, as miraculous as it did. The years that followed did not erase what the fire had cost. They simply built something new on top of it, the way new growth rises, through ground that has burned, before and, against all reasonable expectation, comes back greener for it. Cordelia's journals filled, one after another, deerskin volume after deerskin volume, with everything she had once feared losing, and everything she had never expected to gain. Medicinal knowledge passed down, through generations, written now in a form the wider world could no longer dismiss, as mere superstition. Treaty language, reviewed line by line, clause by clause, so that no company's lawyer could bury a theft inside a promise of peace ever again in that territory, not while she was alive to catch it. Stories, told to her own children in 2 languages at once, until the children stopped noticing there had ever been a line between the two at all. Calloway's empire did not survive the letters Colonel Bishop carried east. It took longer than any of them wanted, these things always did, but a name once exposed does not easily hide itself again, and a company built on quiet paperwork collapses fastest once the paperwork stops staying quiet. Bishop kept his word. Sent copies to newspapers, as well as courts, because he had learned, in 20 years on the frontier, that public shame moved faster than any judge's calendar. Choti's death was mourned, in its way, even by those who understood what he had chosen. Grief, Cordelia wrote once, does not stop being grief simply because the man carrying it made a terrible choice with it. It only becomes a warning, as well as a sorrow. Doyle stood trial, eventually, for what the letters proved. Justice, when it finally arrived slowly and imperfectly, the way it usually does, but it arrived. And Cordelia herself, in the last pages of the last journal she would ever fill, wrote something she had turned over in her mind for years, before she found the words steady enough to set down. I came to this country a widow, who believed her story had already ended, she wrote. I was taken by fire, and I feared, for a long while, that the fire was the whole of what I would ever be known for. But a fire only tells you what it destroys. It never tells you what grows back. I built a life here on the wreckage of a lie someone else told for profit. I found love in an embrace I was never meant to survive long enough to know. I traded one language for two, and found that having two was not a loss of the first, but a doubling of everything I could ever hope to understand. If this life has taught me anything worth passing on, it is only this, that the truth, however long it is buried, however carefully someone works to keep it buried, does not stay buried forever. Somebody always finds the paper in the ash. And when they do, it is worth everything it costs to make sure the world finally reads it. Even now, with silver in my hair, and grandchildren asleep in the next room, I find I would not trade a single hour of it, not the fear, not the grief, not even the fire itself. It made me who I became. And who I became was worth becoming. She closed the journal, the last one, many years after the first fire, surrounded by children and grandchildren who carried both her blood and Natoni's, both her grief and his, both her stubbornness, and a peace neither of them had believed possible on the night a wagon train burned under an indifferent sky. Kimamila lived to see her own children grown, and told little Wren's grandchildren the story of the white woman, who came as a captive, and stayed by choice, until the telling of it had passed, so far down the line, that the youngest listeners could no longer say for certain, where the history ended, and the legend began. Gray Fox's careful reading of every treaty clause became, in time, simply how the people read every paper anyone in Washington ever sent them, twice, slowly, for what it was careful not to say. Natoni's hair went white the way his mother's must have, once. His back stayed straight. His counsel stayed wise. And when he finally passed, peacefully, surrounded by the family two impossible worlds had built together, Cordelia understood that the man, who had once bound her wrists in the dark had spent every year, since then, without exception, undoing that first not one act of trust at a time. Edmund made good on his word too, in his own fashion. The irrigation channels he helped design outlived him by decades, carrying water to fields that had once been considered too dry to farm, and the people who worked those fields never fully knew, most of them, that the practical Boston engineer who'd drawn the plans had done it, first and always, because his sister had asked him to. The stars above Ember Canyon did not care, still, the way stars never care. But the people who stood beneath them now did. And that, in the end, had turned out to be enough.